My name is Nia, 32 years old. I used to believe marrying into a family meant gaining support. I was dead wrong. With a feverish 8-month-old baby crying in my arms and dinner simmering, I was physically and emotionally exhausted beyond all words. While I struggled to keep everything from falling apart, my parents-in-law sat comfortably on my couch watching television as if I was their hired help. But that night, my husband walked through the door and made an announcement that shattered my reality and initiated a brutal chain of events no one saw coming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws. I built my career as a corporate financial consultant from nothing but my success only made me a target. I shifted my son Leo to my hip, bouncing him as his face flushed red with a fever. He let out a miserable wail against my silk blouse. I had just gotten home from a grueling and exhausting 10-hour workday at the corporate financial firm, barely kicking off my heels before starting dinner. My mother-in-law Beatrice and my father-in-law Clarence had been lounging at my house since noon. They claimed they wanted to spend quality time with their grandson, but the reality was far different. From the kitchen, I watched Beatrice stretched out on my velvet sofa, her feet resting squarely on the glass coffee table. She laughed loudly at reality television, lazily popping green grapes into her mouth. Beside her, Clarence was half asleep, the television volume vibrating the floorboards. Neither had offered to take Leo. Earlier, when I walked through the front door, Beatrice had simply glanced at the large wall clock and reminded me that Clarence needed his blood pressure medication with a hot meal by 7. I stirred the pasta sauce. I loved Jamal, but his family operated under an unspoken rule that I was always obligated to serve them. As a woman who worked tirelessly to secure a 6-figure salary and buy this house before I met Jamal, their disrespect stung. Leo cried louder. I asked Beatrice if she could hold him just long enough for me to drain boiling water from the pasta pot. She did not even look away from the screen. She waved her hand and said she did not want whatever bug he brought home. I swallowed my anger, balancing the heavy pot while holding my sick child. The front door swung open and Jamal walked in. He was on his cell phone, laughing loudly with a sales buddy. Jamal was a mid-level sales director, but he carried himself like he owned the company. He wore an expensive tailored suit and a flashy watch bought entirely on credit, always obsessed with projecting black excellence to his followers on social media. He ended his call and tossed his briefcase onto the entryway table, completely ignoring his wailing son. He walked past the living room, giving his parents an energetic greeting. "Hey, Mama. Hey, Dad. Good to see you both looking so relaxed." Beatrice sat up, her entire demeanor softening as she beamed at her golden boy. She told him how proud she was. Jamal eagerly soaked up the praise like a sponge, then finally turned his attention to the kitchen. He did not come over to kiss me or check Leo. Instead, he wrinkled his nose and lifted the lid off the simmering pot. "Is this chicken Alfredo again?" he asked, his tone dripping with disappointment. "I had a heavy lunch with clients and I specifically texted you that I wanted something light, like grilled salmon and asparagus tonight. Did you not check your phone?" I stared at him, exhaustion morphing into disbelief. "I told you Leo has a fever," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor of anger. "I had to leave the office early to pick him up from daycare. I have been holding him for an hour while trying to cook for your parents. I did not have time to stop at the grocery store for salmon." Jamal rolled his eyes and sighed heavily, acting as if my existence was a massive inconvenience. "You always have an excuse," he muttered, loosening his silk tie. "My mother is sitting right there. You could have asked her to watch the boy while you went to the store." "It is not that complicated, Nia. You just lack time management skills." The sheer audacity of his comment left me temporarily speechless. Before I could formulate a response that would not start a screaming match in front of my sick child, Jamal reached into the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of sparkling water, and leaned against the granite counter. "Anyway, I have some great news," he said, his face lighting up with that charismatic smile he reserved for clients. "I had lunch with Chloe today. She finally found the perfect commercial space for her luxury fashion boutique downtown. The landlord accepted her application, and she is ready to start renovations by the end of the month." Chloe was his younger sister, a 28-year-old aspiring entrepreneur whose entire business model consisted of buying cheap wholesale clothes and slapping a designer price tag on them. She had already failed at 3 different business ventures, each time relying on Jamal or Beatrice to bail her out of significant debt. "That is nice for her," I said carefully, turning my attention back to the stove. "I hope she actually wrote a solid business plan this time." Jamal waved off my concern. "She does not need a business plan when she has family backing her up. The total cost for securing the lease, hiring the contractors, and buying the initial inventory comes out to exactly $150,000. I told her not to worry about going to a bank. I promised her we would wire the money into her business account first thing tomorrow morning so she can sign the commercial lease before another tenant takes it." The metal spoon slipped from my hand and clattered loudly onto the tile floor. The sound echoed through the kitchen, but I barely registered it. I turned to face my husband, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I stared into his arrogant, smiling face, trying to comprehend the absolute madness of what he had just said. "Excuse me," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You promised her what?" $150,000. Jamal repeated, speaking slowly as if I were a child who did not understand basic math. "It is an investment in my sister. It is about building generational wealth, Nia. We have to support Black-owned businesses, especially when it is our own blood." I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. Leo whimpered against my chest, and I rubbed his back mechanically, my eyes locked onto Jamal. "That $150,000 in our joint, high-yield savings account is not family money," I stated, enunciating every single syllable clearly. "That money consists entirely of my end-of-year corporate bonus, my stock dividends, and the college fund I carefully started for Leo Future. You do not have the right to promise a single dime of it to anyone, let alone your sister." Jamal scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Do not do that, Nia. Do not be selfish. We are husband and wife. Your money is my money, and my money is your money. Chloe needs this. She is family. I already gave her my word, and I am not going to look like a liar to my own sister because my wife wants to hoard cash in a bank account." I took a step forward. "You will not touch that money, Jamal. I worked grueling 80-hour weeks while heavily pregnant to earn that bonus. Chloe is deeply financially irresponsible and completely entitled. I will not let you throw our son Future away to fund her delusions." Jamal's face hardened, the charming facade vanishing entirely. He stepped into my personal space, towering over me. His voice dropped to a threatening edge that made my blood run cold. "You do not get to dictate how I help my blood, Nia. You are my wife, but you do not run me. I am the head of this household. When I say we are funding my sister business, we are funding it. You need to learn your place and stop acting like your paycheck makes you the boss." I tightened my grip on my crying son, feeling the ultimate betrayal settling heavily in the room. "You touch 1 single cent of my hard-earned money," I warned him, "and you will regret it for the rest of your natural life." The air in the kitchen grew thick, heavy with the weight of my ultimatum. Jamal stared at me, a muscle feathering in his jaw. For a second, the only sound in the house was the rhythmic bubbling of the pasta water and Leo's soft whimpers against my chest. Jamal hated being challenged, especially regarding his family and his fragile ego. He opened his mouth to shout, his hands balling into fists at his sides, but the sudden scraping of a chair from the living room interrupted him. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approached the kitchen. Beatrice marched into the room, her presence immediately sucking all the oxygen from the space. Clarence shuffled in a few steps behind her, remaining silent, a mere shadow to his wife commanding presence. Beatrice smoothed the front of her expensive silk blouse, a gift I had purchased for her previous birthday, and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. Her eyes darted from my messy hair to the crying baby in my arms and finally settled on my face with a look of pure contempt. "Is there a problem in here?" Beatrice asked. Her voice was deceptively calm, laced with that southern church lady sweetness that always masked her venom. "We can hear you raising your voice at my son all the way in the living room, Nia. A good wife does not bark at her husband after he comes home from a long day of providing for his family." Providing. I repeated the absurdity of the statement, briefly overriding my fury. Beatrice. I pay the mortgage on this house. I pay the utilities. I even paid for the groceries simmering on that stove right now. Jamal providing consists of leasing a car he cannot afford and buying designer suits to impress strangers on the internet. He is trying to take my end-of-year bonus to fund Chloe's latest delusion. Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She took a step closer, invading my space, her expensive perfume clashing with the smell of garlic and tomatoes. You listen to me very carefully, little girl, she began, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. You think because you sit in a fancy glass office and wear nice suits that you are somehow better than us. You think that paycheck makes you a queen, but you forget where you came from. I tightened my grip on Leo. My mother had passed away when I was in college, and my father had never been in the picture. I fought tooth and nail for every single thing I possessed. Beatrice knew this. She knew the scars I carried from navigating the world completely alone, and she knew exactly how to weaponize them to maintain her matriarchal dominance. You came into my son life with nobody. Beatrice continued, her voice rising in volume, echoing off the tile walls. No family, no background, no legacy. We opened our arms to you. We gave you a family name respected in our church and our community. You should be down on your knees thanking God every single day that a man of Jamal caliber was willing to settle down with a woman who had absolutely no one. I felt a cold lump form in my throat, not from sadness, but from the sheer audacity of her cruelty. Clarence stood silently by the refrigerator, looking at the floor, perfectly content to let his wife verbally eviscerate the mother of his grandson. Chloe is Jamal's sister. Beatrice declared, her eyes flashing with a terrifying sense of entitlement. She is blood. And in this family, blood comes first. You are just a lucky orphan we let into this family. What is yours belongs to my son. Therefore, it belongs to this family. If he says the money goes to Chloe, then the money goes to Chloe. End of discussion. The words hung in the air, toxic and suffocating. A lucky orphan. What is yours belongs to my son. I slowly turned my head to look at Jamal. My husband, the man who stood before God and a congregation of 200 people and swore to protect me, to forsake all others, to build a life with me. I looked at him, waiting for the inevitable defense. I waited for him to step between me and his mother, to tell her she had crossed an unforgivable line to defend the mother of his child. I searched his eyes for a flicker of loyalty. Just 1 ounce of the love he constantly professed to have for me online when he posted hashtags about Black love and building a modern empire. Jamal did not step between us. Instead, he took a deliberate step to the side, closing the distance between himself and his mother. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Beatrice, forming a united front against me. The visual impact of that single step hit me harder than a physical blow. He had made his choice. Mama is right, Jamal said, his voice cold and devoid of any affection. I am sick and tired of your disrespectful attitude, Nia. You walk around here with your nose in the air, calculating every penny, acting like you run things. You do not understand family loyalty because you never had a real family to begin with. The air was completely knocked out of my lungs. I stopped breathing. Leo shifted in my arms, his small hands clutching the collar of my shirt. You are a failed wife, Jamal continued, emboldened by his mother approving nods. A real woman, a good wife, stands behind her husband's vision. She supports his family. She does not hoard money like a selfish miser when her own sister-in-law is trying to build a legacy. You are so obsessed with your corporate title that you forgot your place in this house. He stepped closer, his chest puffed out, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. And let us get one thing straight. I do not ever want to hear you raise your voice at my mother again. I forbid you from disrespecting her under my roof. You will transfer that money to my account by tomorrow morning, or we are going to have a very serious problem. Do you understand me? Under my roof. The sheer, breathtaking delusion of those 3 words echoed in my mind. I bought this 4-bedroom suburban house 2 years before I even met Jamal. The deed was solely in my name. The mortgage was deducted automatically from my personal checking account every first of the month. Yet here he was standing in my kitchen, claiming ownership of my property, my money, and my autonomy, simply because he was a man and I was his wife. 5 minutes ago, I had been ready to scream. I had been ready to throw the pot of boiling pasta against the wall, to curse them both out, to demand they leave my house immediately. The fire of righteous indignation had been burning so hot in my veins that I felt like I could tear the entire house down to the studs. But as I looked at Jamal's arrogant sneer and Beatrice's triumphant smirk, the fire instantly died. It was not extinguished by fear or submission. It was replaced by ice. Absolute freezing crystalline ice. Screaming would mean I still cared about their opinions. Crying would mean they still had the power to hurt me. Arguing would imply that this was a negotiation, that there was still a marriage left to save. There was no marriage left. The man standing in front of me was not a partner, he was a parasite, and his mother was the queen of the hive, directing him to drain me dry. The emotional shock crystallized into a cold, calculating silence. My heart rate, which had been pounding frantically against my ribs just moments before, slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat. I felt a bizarre sense of clarity wash over my mind. I saw them exactly for what they were. They were thieves trying to steal my son's future, convinced I was too weak and too desperate for a family to stop them. They thought my silence was submission. Beatrice crossed her arms, a look of profound satisfaction settling on her face. Jamal smirked clearly, believing he had successfully put me in my place. He turned his back to me, opening the refrigerator again to grab another drink, acting as if the conflict was entirely resolved in his favor. I did not say a single word. I did not shed a single tear. I carefully adjusted Leo's weight on my hip, supporting his feverish head with my palm. I reached over to the stove with my free hand. I turned the burner dial all the way to the left, listening to the soft click as the gas flame extinguished. The bubbling of the pasta water ceased. The kitchen grew eerily quiet. Without a backward glance, without acknowledging their existence, I turned on my heel and walked out of the kitchen. "Nia, where are you going?" Jamal called out, his voice tinged with sudden confusion at my lack of response. I said I wanted dinner. I ignored him. My footsteps were silent on the hardwood floor as I walked through the hallway and climbed the stairs. Every step I took was methodical. The woman who had walked down these stairs earlier that afternoon, the exhausted, desperate wife trying to hold her marriage and household together, was dead. I reached the nursery and quietly closed the door behind me, twisting the lock until it clicked securely into place. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a star-shaped nightlight. I gently laid Leo down in his crib, soothing his forehead with a cool washcloth, until his whimpering subsided and he drifted back into a restless sleep. I stood in the center of the dark nursery, listening to the muffled sounds of Jamal and Beatrice complaining downstairs about the unfinished food. They thought the argument was over. They thought they had won. They had no idea that their reckless greed had just awakened a monster, and I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. I sat in the rocking chair by the window. The steady rhythm of my breathing matched the soft hum of the white noise machine. I waited in the dark. For hours I did not move. I listened to the muffled sounds of the house settling. I heard the front door finally open and close around 10 o'clock as Beatrice and Clarence left. I heard Jamal's heavy footsteps on the stairs. He paused outside the nursery door. The brass handle rattled slightly as he tested the lock. When it did not turn, he let out an annoyed huff, muttered something under his breath, and walked down the hall to the master bedroom. I waited until the shower ran, until the pipes groaned, and until the house descended into complete silence. The digital clock on the dresser glowed a faint green. 2 in the morning. I stood up, my joints stiff from sitting completely still for so long. I moved to the small desk tucked in the corner of the nursery and opened my work laptop. The sudden harsh blue light of the screen illuminated the dark room, casting long shadows against the pale walls. I turned the brightness down to its lowest setting, my hands moving with practiced efficiency. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a primal warning system screaming that I was about to uncover something devastating. I opened a secure browser window and typed in the web address for our primary banking institution. Jamal and I maintained separate personal accounts for our daily expenses, but we shared one massive high-yield joint savings account. That account held the foundation of our family future. It held my corporate bonuses, the dividends from my stock portfolio, and the carefully accumulated funds intended for Leo college tuition. It was a fortress of financial security that I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I typed in my username and password. The loading icon spun for a fraction of a second, a tiny circle that felt like it took an eternity to resolve. The dashboard materialized on the screen. I stared at the balance. I blinked, rubbed my tired eyes, and leaned closer to the glowing monitor. My brain, trained to analyze complex corporate financial structures, temporarily refused to process the simple arithmetic displayed in front of me. The account was empty. Not just depleted, drained. The balance sat at a mocking 0.00. A wave of profound nausea washed over me. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, my eyes darting frantically across the transaction history. Jamal had not just promised the money to his sister, he had already taken it. The ledger showed a massive outgoing wire transfer initiated 2 days prior, moving exactly $150,000 into a newly formed corporate account registered under Chloe's name. He had lied to my face in the kitchen. He had stood there arguing with me about transferring the money tomorrow morning, knowing full well the funds were already gone. He had drained my life savings, the money I had bled for while I was sitting in my office working to provide for our family. Panic, raw and suffocating, clawed at my throat. My hands shook so violently I could barely navigate the trackpad. But then the initial shock began to recede, forcefully pushed aside by the cold, analytical instincts that had made me a top-tier corporate financial consultant. The terrified wife was pushed aside. The forensic auditor took over. If Jamal was bold enough to wire $150,000 out of our joint savings without my authorization, what else was he hiding? A man who could execute a premeditated financial strike of that magnitude did not just stop at one account. Thieves of opportunity took what they could. Thieves of entitlement took everything. I opened a new tab and logged into a comprehensive credit monitoring bureau. I bypassed the standard consumer dashboard and pulled a deep, itemized background credit report on myself. The progress bar crept across the top of the screen. I held my breath, the blue light from the monitor reflecting in my wide eyes. The report populated. My credit score, which I had rigorously maintained at a flawless 810 for the past decade, had plummeted by over 100 points. My eyes scanned down to the active liabilities section. My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. There, sitting like a venomous snake in the middle of my financial profile, was a newly opened credit line. It was not a credit card, it was not a personal loan, it was a home equity line of credit, a HELOC. The principal amount was staggering, $300,000. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. My vision blurred around the edges. I gripped the edges of the desk so hard my knuckles turned stark white. A HELOC of that size required collateral. It required a physical asset to secure the debt, and I only owned one asset valuable enough to secure a $300,000 line of credit: my house. The 4-bedroom suburban sanctuary I had purchased 2 years before I even met Jamal. The deed was solely in my name. The mortgage was in my name. The property was my ultimate safety net, my premarital asset entirely separate from our union. To secure a home equity line of credit on a property titled solely in my name, the bank would require my explicit in-person authorization. They would require my government-issued identification. They would require my physical signature on a mountain of legal documents sworn and verified in the presence of a licensed notary public. I had never signed those papers. I had never authorized that loan. I had never stepped foot in a bank to leverage my home. Jamal had forged my signature. The sheer magnitude of his crime crashed down on me, threatening to crush the breath right out of my lungs. This was not just financial infidelity. This was not just a husband being irresponsible with money. This was a calculated, deliberate federal crime. Jamal had committed felony identity theft and wire fraud to mortgage the roof over his own infant son's head. I quickly pulled up the county property records database, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I navigated through the public registry searching for the parcel number associated with my address. I found the deed history. There it was, uploaded and filed just 3 weeks ago. A lien had been placed against my property by a major national bank. I downloaded the attached public document, zooming in on the final page of the loan agreement. I stared at the signature line. It was my name spelled out in blue ink, but the handwriting was completely wrong. The loops were too wide, the pressure too heavy. It was a decent forgery, perhaps good enough to fool a careless loan officer, but I knew my own handwriting. More importantly, I looked at the notary stamp beside the forged signature. The stamp belonged to a man named Thomas Vance. I recognized the name immediately. He was a deacon at Beatrice Mega Church, a man who frequently attended Jamal weekly poker games. They had conspired together. Jamal had used his mother's religious connections to find a corrupt notary willing to authenticate a forged signature on a federal banking document. They had stolen my identity to steal my house. The terror was absolute. I was legally and financially tied to a criminal. If Jamal defaulted on this $300,000 loan, the bank would not go after him. They would come after me. They would foreclose on my home. They would destroy my credit, my career, and my ability to provide for Leo. Jamal had effectively shackled me to a sinking ship, ensuring that if his reckless spending caught up with him, I would be the one to drown. I sat back in the rocking chair, the glow of the laptop screen casting a pale, ghostly light across my face. The room was freezing, but sweat beaded on my forehead. My husband had mortgaged my house. He had stolen my savings. He had financed his family delusions using my identity. I looked over at the crib. Leo was sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He had no idea that his father had just jeopardized his entire future. He had no idea that the safety and security I had broken my back to build for him had been sold off to fund Chloe fake fashion boutique and Beatrice luxury lifestyle. A profound, suffocating sense of isolation washed over me. I was completely alone. I had no parents to call. I had no siblings to lean on. I was trapped in a house with a man who had proven he would gladly destroy me to elevate himself. If I confronted him now, he would deny it. He would use his physical size to intimidate me, just as he had done in the kitchen. If I told the police without an airtight bulletproof case, Jamal would use his mother church connections and his charismatic facade to paint me as a hysterical postpartum wife making wild accusations. He had carefully orchestrated this entire situation to leave me powerless. He had drained my liquid cash so I could not easily hire a top-tier lawyer. He had leveraged my house so I could not sell it to escape. He had trapped me in a financial cage, expecting me to eventually submit to his authority simply because I had no other options left. But Jamal had made one critical, fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the sheer terrifying focus of a mother who realizes her child's survival is under threat. He thought I was just a corporate worker, too busy and too tired to look closely at the numbers. He forgot that I analyzed complex corporate fraud for a living. I tracked missing millions for Fortune 500 companies. Untangling the clumsy, arrogant financial crimes of a narcissistic mid-level sales director and his corrupt church buddies was not just within my skill set. It was my specialty. The terror that had gripped me moments before dissolved, hardening into a weaponized resolve. I was not going to panic. I was not going to break down. I was going to systematically, ruthlessly destroy him. I reached for my laptop again. I began downloading everything. I saved the wire transfer receipts. I downloaded the fraudulent deed and the HELOC agreement. I pulled the detailed credit reports. I created encrypted password-protected folders and backed up every single piece of evidence to an external cloud server that Jamal did not know existed. I was building a federal indictment right from the nursery rocking chair. The clock on the dresser shifted to 4 a.m. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark, plunging the room back into shadows. The silence of the house felt different now. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home. It was the stillness of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. Jamal was sleeping just down the hall, dreaming of his fake wealth and his mother approval. He had no idea that his wife had just become his executioner. I opened a new, highly encrypted tab. The $300,000 home equity line of credit had to leave a digital footprint. Banks did not just hand over briefcases of cash. The funds were dispersed into a newly created checking account, one Jamal had cleverly hidden from our main dashboard, but linked under his primary social security number. With a few keystrokes and my elevated access credentials, I bypassed the superficial barriers and pulled the detailed transaction ledger for that specific dispersal account. The money had landed exactly 18 days ago. By day 19, the bleeding had begun. I traced the first outgoing wire. $85,000 transferred to an entity called Chloe Kuchar Limited Liability Company. That covered the commercial lease deposit, the overpriced interior design contractors, and the initial inventory for her fake luxury boutique. Jamal had literally mortgaged my son's childhood home so his spoiled sister could play business owner downtown. But that left $215,000 unaccounted for. My eyes scanned down to the second major wire transfer. This one made my breath catch in my throat. $120,000 routed to an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary name was obscured behind a shell corporation, but the routing sequence matched a known offshore sports betting syndicate I had investigated during a corporate fraud audit 2 years prior. I dug into Jamal's recent email archives utilizing the shared password he foolishly thought I had forgotten. I searched the dates corresponding to the wire transfer. There it was, a frantic, pathetic email chain between Jamal and his brother-in-law, Darius. Darius, the flashy husband of Chloe, the man who drove a leased Maserati and constantly bragged about his real estate investments at Sunday dinner. The emails revealed a terrifying truth. Darius was completely bankrupt. He owed over $100,000 to dangerous underground bookmakers. He had begged Jamal for a bailout, crying that these violent men were threatening to show up at Chloe Boutique. Jamal, desperate to be the savior and the big man of the family, had stolen my house equity to pay off a degenerate gambler debts. I felt a physical wave of revulsion. I was financing a criminal gambling syndicate because my husband wanted to play the hero for a man who refused to get a real job. I turned my attention back to the ledger. There was still $95,000 missing. The final major transaction cleared just 5 days ago. A certified cashier check drawn directly from the HELOC account and made payable to a high-end luxury automotive dealership on the wealthy north side of the city. I knew exactly what that was. Just last Sunday, Beatrice had pulled into the church parking lot, driving a pristine, fully loaded, brand-new Mercedes SUV. She had stepped out of the vehicle wearing a matching designer hat, loudly boasting to the entire congregation that her successful, devoted son had purchased it for her as an early Mother's Day gift. The church ladies had swooned, praising Jamal for his black excellence and his deep respect for the woman who raised him. Beatrice had soaked up the adoration, positioning herself as the ultimate matriarch blessed by God and her golden child. She was driving a car bought with stolen money. She was parading around the church parking lot in a vehicle financed by the fraudulent mortgage placed on the home of her orphaned daughter-in-law. The sheer, unadulterated evil of it all was almost too vast to comprehend. Jamal had decimated our family financial security. He had risked making his own infant son homeless. And for what? To buy his sister a fake business to save his degenerate brother-in-law from loan sharks, and to buy his toxic mother a vanity vehicle so she could flex on the other women at church. They were a family of financial vampires masquerading as high society royalty. I sat back in the rocking chair, the glow of the screen illuminating the cold reality of my marriage. Jamal did not love me. He did not even view me as a human being. I was nothing more than a host, a resource to be harvested to fund their collective delusions of grandeur. He had looked at my pristine credit score, my hard-earned property, and my exhaustive savings, and he had seen a limitless ATM for his family. I closed the laptop and placed it carefully inside my leather work tote. I checked the time. 5 in the morning. The sun would be rising soon. I had to move, and I had to move with absolute precision. I walked to the closet and pulled down a small, nondescript duffel bag from the highest shelf. I moved silently, my bare feet making no sound on the plush nursery carpet. I packed Leo necessities first. Diapers formula, his favorite soft blanket, and enough clothes to last a week. Next, I packed a few basic items for myself. A change of business clothes, comfortable shoes, and my most critical physical documents, including my passport, Leo birth certificate, and the original deed to the house showing my sole ownership before the fraudulent lien was attached. I zipped the bag shut. I slipped out of the nursery, crept down the stairs, and quietly exited through the garage door. I popped the trunk of my sedan and shoved the go bag deep into the back, hiding it beneath the spare tire cover. I locked the car and slipped back inside the house, just as the alarm clock in the master bedroom began to blare. I returned to the kitchen and began making coffee, forcing my hands to remain steady. Jamal came down the stairs 20 minutes later, dressed in a fresh custom suit smelling of expensive cologne. He walked into the kitchen entirely unbothered, acting as if the vicious argument from last night had never occurred. "Morning," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I am meeting Chloe at the boutique space today to go over contractor bids. Have that transfer ready by noon, Nia. We cannot afford any delays." I kept my back to him, staring blankly at the granite countertop. "I will handle the finances today," I replied, my voice carefully monotone. "Good," he grunted, taking a sip of his coffee. "See you tonight." He walked out the door without a second glance. The moment his leased sports car backed out of the driveway, I pulled out my cell phone. I bypassed my regular contacts and opened a secure messaging application. I typed a message to the only person in the world I could trust with this level of catastrophic betrayal. Attorney Sterling was a 55-year-old legal shark, a brilliant, no-nonsense veteran lawyer who specialized in high-asset divorces and corporate litigation. More importantly, she was a fierce former sorority sister of my late mother. She had always watched over me from a distance, serving as an unofficial aunt when I had no one else. I typed the message with shaking fingers. "I need your help." Jamal forged my signature on a $300,000 home equity line. He stole my savings. He is financing his family. I am packing a bag for Leo and myself. I am leaving him today. Please tell me what to do. Now. The response came less than a minute later. "Do not confront him. Go to work as usual. Act completely normal. Leave the office exactly at 3. Pick up the baby from daycare. Come straight to my secure office downtown. We are filing federal charges." I read the message twice, internalizing the instructions. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves. I fed Leo, administered his fever reducer, and dropped him off at his trusted daycare facility, kissing his warm forehead a little longer than usual. I drove to my corporate office and sat at my desk for 6 hours, performing the hardest acting job of my entire life. I answered emails. I led financial strategy meetings. I smiled at my colleagues, all while a violent hurricane of betrayal and rage tore through my chest. At exactly 2:45 in the afternoon, I packed up my laptop. I told my assistant I was leaving early due to Leo lingering fever. I rode the elevator down to the parking garage, my heart pounding with the anticipation of permanent escape. The plan was flawless. I would secure my son drive to Attorney Sterling and drop the legal hammer on Jamal's entire existence. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic, heading toward the suburban daycare center. As I drove, my mind raced through the logistics of the coming days. I would need to freeze all remaining accounts, place fraud alerts on my social security number, and secure a temporary restraining order to keep Jamal and Beatrice away from Leo while the federal investigation launched. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A notification popped up from the home security system I had installed 2 years ago. Motion detected at the front door. I glanced at the screen at a red light, expecting to see a delivery driver. Instead, I saw Beatrice. She was standing on my front porch, pointing aggressively at the camera. Behind her stood Clarence, looking nervous. And standing next to the driveway were 2 marked police cruisers. A cold spike of adrenaline shot straight through my heart. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, redirecting my route away from the daycare and sprinting toward my neighborhood. The drive felt agonizingly slow. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my forearms ached. What were the police doing at my house? Why was Beatrice there in the middle of the afternoon? I turned the corner onto my street and slammed on the brakes. My house was surrounded. Jamal's sports car was parked haphazardly on the lawn. Chloe's luxury boutique van was blocking the driveway. 2 police officers stood on the manicured grass, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. But that was not the sight that made the world drop out from underneath me. Lining the edge of the sidewalk dumped unceremoniously onto the wet grass were heavy black trash bags. I recognized the fabric of my designer suit spilling out of one of the torn plastic bags. My shoes, my personal documents, my life tossed onto the street like garbage. And standing on the front steps of the house that I paid for, was Jamal. He was holding a stack of legal documents in his hand, speaking animatedly to one of the police officers. He was pointing toward my approaching car, his face twisted into an expression of theatrical, exaggerated fear. I threw the car into park and threw open the door, my pulse roaring in my ears. I had rushed home to enact my exit plan to finally break free from their parasitic grip. But as I stepped onto the pavement and saw the triumphant, malicious smirk spread across Beatrice's face, I realized with devastating clarity that Jamal had struck first. I was walking straight into a trap. I stepped out of my vehicle, the heavy door slamming shut behind me with a hollow thud that echoed down the quiet suburban street. My legs felt like lead, but my mind was racing at 1,000 miles per hour. The manicured lawn I paid a landscaping service to maintain every Tuesday was now a dumping ground for my entire existence. I took a step forward, my eyes locking onto a ripped black garbage bag near the edge of the driveway. A pair of my custom Italian leather pumps spilled out onto the damp soil. Next to it, an expensive silk blazer was crumpled against the concrete curb, stained with dirt and careless disregard. They had not just packed my belongings. They had violated them. They had turned my hard-earned life into street trash. "Ma'am, I need you to stay right there by your vehicle," a stern voice commanded. I snapped my attention to the two police officers advancing toward me. They had their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts, their body language defensive and rigid. They were looking at me not as a homeowner returning from work, but as a hostile threat. I stopped moving. I raised my hands slightly to show I was unarmed and cooperative. "Officer, this is my house," I said, forcing my voice to remain as calm and measured as possible. "My name is on the deed. These people are trespassing and destroying my property." Before the officer could respond, a loud, theatrical sob echoed from the front porch. I shifted my gaze and felt all the blood drain from my face. Jamal was standing on the top step, clutching my 8-month-old son tightly against his chest. A wave of pure, unfiltered panic slammed into me. I had dropped Leo off at his secure daycare facility just hours ago. I specifically kissed his feverish forehead and told the staff I would be back by 3. Jamal must have completely bypassed his supposed contractor meetings downtown, driven straight to the daycare center, and used his legal status as the father to pull Leo out early. He had stolen my baby from his safe environment specifically to use him as a human shield and a prop for this sick, twisted performance. "Please, officer, keep her away from us!" Jamal cried out. His voice was trembling thick with manufactured terror. He buried his face into the side of Leo's blanket, actively squeezing out fake tears. "She is not in her right mind. She has been threatening us all morning. I am terrified she is going to hurt the baby." Beatrice stepped forward, flanking her son like a protective gargoyle. She clutched the collar of her expensive blouse, her face twisted into a mask of maternal agony. "She is deeply unwell," Officer Beatrice wailed, her voice projecting loudly enough for the neighbors across the street to hear. "My poor daughter-in-law has been suffering from severe postpartum psychosis for months. We have tried to get her help. We have begged her to see a doctor, but she is having a complete mental break. She threatened to burn the house down with all of us inside it. We had to change the locks just to protect my innocent grandson." I stared at them, completely mesmerized by the sheer, unadulterated evil of their performance. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They had weaponized my identity as a hard-working, exhausted new mother and twisted it into a narrative of dangerous insanity. They knew exactly how the legal system and the police would respond to a frantic father claiming his wife was experiencing a postpartum psychotic break. "That is an absolute lie," I said, looking directly at the older police officer. "I am the corporate financial director of a major consulting firm. I have been at my desk working all day. I have no history of mental illness. My husband just committed federal wire fraud and forged my signature on a $300,000 home equity line of credit. I discovered it last night, and he is doing this to lock me out before I can press charges. The officer held up a hand, his expression entirely unsympathetic. Ma'am, we are not here to debate financial disputes or fraud allegations. That is a civil matter for the courts. We are here to enforce a lawful court order, a court order. The words hit me like a physical strike to the chest. Jamal slowly descended the porch steps, keeping the police officers securely between him and me. He was still holding Leo, who was beginning to fuss, disturbed by the tension and the strange environment. Jamal reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded legal papers. He handed them to the officer, who then stepped forward and extended the documents toward me. "You have been served," Jamal said, his voice dropping the theatrical tremble for a fraction of a second. I saw the malicious, triumphant gleam in his eyes. I took the papers. My hands shook as I unfolded them. The bold black text at the top of the first page confirmed my absolute worst nightmare. Emergency ex parte temporary restraining order and order of protection. I scanned the documents, my financial consultant brain rapidly absorbing the legal terminology. Jamal had marched into a family courthouse first thing this morning. An ex parte order meant he had presented his case to a judge completely in private without me being notified or given any opportunity to defend myself. He had submitted a sworn affidavit filled with horrific fabricated lies. He claimed I was physically abusive. He claimed I was suffering from violent hallucinations. He claimed I had threatened to drown our son and burn our property to the ground. Because family courts prioritize the immediate safety of the child above all else, the judge had rubber-stamped the temporary order without requiring a shred of actual proof. The hearing to challenge the order was set for 14 days from now. For 14 days, I was legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of my own house. I was forbidden from contacting my husband or his family. And most devastatingly of all, I was legally stripped of all custody and forbidden from coming anywhere near my infant son. He planned this perfectly. The realization washed over me cold and paralyzing. Jamal knew that if I stayed in the house, I would inevitably uncover the massive web of financial crimes he had committed. I would find the fake notary documents. I would find the wire transfers to Darius' illegal bookmakers. I would find the receipts for Beatrice luxury car and Chloe fake boutique. He needed me out of the house, and he needed me stripped of my credibility. By branding me as a psychotic, dangerous mother, he ensured that if I went to the police claiming he committed fraud, they would view me as a crazy, vindictive wife violating a restraining order. He had weaponized the justice system to secure his crime scene and hold my child hostage. "Officer, you have to look at this rationally." I pleaded, my voice tight with suppressed panic. "My son has a fever. He needs his medication. I am his primary caregiver. That man does not even know the name of our pediatrician. You cannot let him take my baby based on a piece of paper filled with lies." The officer placed his hand firmly on his duty belt, his stance widening. "Ma'am, I am going to tell you this one time. You are currently in violation of a judge lawful order just by standing in this driveway. You need to return to your vehicle and vacate these premises immediately. If you attempt to approach that child or breach that front door, I will arrest you on the spot for violating a restraining order. You can argue your case to the judge in 2 weeks, but today you are leaving." I looked past the officer, staring directly at Jamal. He was bouncing Leo on his hip, putting on a show of being the comforting, protective father. Chloe had stepped out of her luxury boutique van, leaning against the hood with her arms crossed, a smug, satisfied grin plastered across her face. Clarence stood silently on the porch, staring at his shoes, a cowardly accomplice to the destruction of my life. And Beatrice stepped forward, standing right at the boundary line of the police officer's protection. She looked at my ruined designer clothes scattered across the wet grass, and then she looked at me. "You should pack up whatever trash is left on this lawn and go find yourself a shelter." "Nia," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with cruel, venomous satisfaction. "You never belonged in this neighborhood anyway. Go back to the projects where you came from. The boy belongs to us now. We will make sure he is raised by a real family." The urge to lunge forward was almost overpowering. Every maternal instinct inside my body screamed at me to tear through those officers, tackle Jamal to the concrete, and rip my crying child from his arms. The violent primal rage was so intense it clouded my vision and made my ears ring. But the cold analytical part of my brain, the survivor instinct that had kept me alive when I was orphaned and alone, threw up a massive blockade. If I fought them now, I would be arrested. I would be handcuffed, thrown in the back of a police cruiser, and booked into the county jail for assault and violating a protective order. I would give Jamal the exact photographic evidence he needed to make the temporary custody order permanent. I would be giving up the war just to lose a battle on my front lawn. I could not let them win. I could not let them turn me into the hysterical stereotype they had painted for the judge. I slowly lowered the legal documents, gripping them tightly in my hand. I did not scream. I did not curse. I did not shed a single tear for them to feast upon. I looked Beatrice dead in the eye, my face a mask of absolute unyielding ice. "I will be seeing you all very soon," I said softly. I turned my back on them. I did not bend down to pick up my ruined clothes. I left the silk and leather to rot in the mud. They were just material things bought with money I could easily make again. I walked back to my car, my spine completely straight, my head held high. I opened the driver door and slid into the seat. I started the engine, the low hum vibrating through the steering wheel. I put the car in reverse and slowly backed out of the driveway, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to give Jamal or Beatrice the satisfaction of a final glance. I drove down the suburban street, watching the house I had bought and paid for fade away in the rearview mirror. I watched the flashing lights of the police cruisers shrink into the distance. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had stripped me of my power, my home, and my child. They had no idea that they had just forced me to take off the gloves. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up my phone. I opened the secure message thread with Attorney Sterling. They locked me out and took Leo with an ex parte order. I typed, my thumbs flying across the digital keyboard. "I am not crying. I am going to war. I am on my way to your house. Get the federal indictments ready. We are burning them to the ground." I hit send and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The screen went dark, but the reality of what had just happened was blindingly bright. For the first 2 miles, I drove with mechanical precision. I stopped at every red light. I used my turn signals. I was a phantom, maneuvering a 2-ton machine through the wealthy suburban streets I had paid to live in. The adrenaline that had kept my spine rigid and my voice steady was still flooding my veins, a chemical armor protecting me from the unbearable truth. But as I turned onto the interstate, distancing myself from the neighborhood, the armor began to crack. I glanced at the rearview mirror out of sheer maternal habit. The back seat was empty. Leo, rear-facing car seat, sat there, a hollow padded shell. Just this morning, I had tickled his small, warm toes while strapping him in. I had kissed his feverish cheek and promised him Mommy would be back before dinner. Now, he was trapped in a house with a man who viewed him as a legal chess piece and a grandmother who viewed him as a trophy. The first sob tore out of my throat before I could stop it. It was not a delicate, quiet sound. It was a violent, guttural heave that ripped through my chest and stole the oxygen from my lungs. I swerved hard onto the gravel shoulder of the highway, slamming the gear shift into park. I could not see the road anymore. My vision was completely obscured by a tidal wave of tears. I threw off my seatbelt, doubling over the steering wheel, and let out a sound I had never heard myself make before. It was the primal, agonizing scream of a mother physically severed from her infant. The physical pain was overwhelming. My chest ached with the heavy, dull throb of a nursing mother missing her child. My arms felt physically empty, aching with the phantom weight of his body. They had taken my baby. They had weaponized my long hours at the office, the very hours I worked to secure his future, and twisted them into a narrative of abandonment. Jamal had handed my feverish son over to Beatrice, a woman who had complained about catching his germs just the night before. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, the horn blaring loudly, joining my screams into the empty space of the car. I screamed until my throat was raw and tasting of copper. I screamed for the years I had wasted trying to make Jamal feel like a king while he secretly planned my execution. I screamed for the relentless, exhausting effort of trying to be the perfect corporate executive, the perfect wife and the perfect mother, only to be tossed out like trash on my own front lawn. Beatrice's parting words echoed in my mind, a toxic loop playing over and over. Go back to the projects. The boy belongs to us now. She thought she had won. She thought stripping me of my dignity, my property, and my child would shatter me into a million irreparable pieces. She expected me to crawl into a dark hole and die of a broken heart. She expected me to fight blindly, to show up at her church or my house screaming like a lunatic, giving them exactly the evidence they needed to permanently terminate my maternal rights. I rested my forehead against the cool leather of the steering wheel, gasping for air. The windows of my car were completely fogged up from my ragged breathing. I sat there on the side of the highway for 20 minutes, letting the absolute worst of the grief wash over me, letting the sheer terror of losing Leo run its course. I allowed the pain to break me down to the very foundation of my soul. And then I stopped crying. The transition was not gradual. It was immediate and absolute. The tears stopped falling. My breathing slowed, evening out into long, measured intakes of air. I lifted my head from the steering wheel and looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes were bloodshot. My mascara was ruined. My hair was disheveled. I looked like the broken, defeated woman Jamal and Beatrice wanted me to be. I reached into the center console, pulled out a packet of makeup wipes, and began scrubbing the ruined mascara from my face. With every swipe, I was erasing the accommodating patient, forgiving wife who had endured their disrespect for the sake of family harmony. That woman was dead. They had killed her on the front lawn. In her place emerged something entirely different. The grief evaporated, replaced by a cold, concentrated, and lethal rage. It was not a chaotic anger. It was the terrifying clinical focus of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to destroy. Jamal thought he was playing chess because he managed to secure a fraudulent ex parte order. He thought he was a mastermind because he found a corrupt notary and a sympathetic judge. He had no concept of the war he had just initiated. He had poked a sleeping bear, believing he had killed it, unaware that he had just invited a predator into his home. I started the engine. The roar of the motor felt different now, no longer a vehicle of escape, but a chariot of retribution. I merged back onto the highway, the tires gripping the asphalt with renewed purpose. I sat in the back of a heavily tinted black SUV parked directly across the street from the Montgomery Tower. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the grand lobby, I had a flawless front-row seat to the absolute peak of their delusion. The gala was in full swing, and they had spared no expense with my stolen money. The sprawling marble floors of my building had been transformed into a scene of staggering performative opulence. Waiters in crisp black tuxedos circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and imported hors d'oeuvres. A live jazz quartet played smooth, sophisticated music from a raised platform near the cascading indoor waterfall. I watched the toxic hierarchy of my former family display itself for the entire city to see. Beatrice was entirely in her element. She wore a glittering floor-length emerald gown that swept across the polished stone. She was holding court with the senior pastor of her megachurch and two prominent local city council members. I could see her laughing warmly, touching the pastor on the arm, pointing proudly toward the frosted glass doors of Chloe New Luxury Boutique. She was playing the role of the triumphant, deeply blessed matriarch who had successfully guided her flock through a storm. Chloe stood near the entrance of her fake business, posing for professional photographers. She was draped in designer labels, holding a glass of champagne, and directing the cameras to capture the custom Italian marble and the gold leaf display cases she had installed using the equity ripped from my home. Darius lingered near the open bar, nursing a glass of top-shelf bourbon. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and laughed too loudly at jokes made by men he desperately wanted to impress. He looked entirely relaxed, completely oblivious to the fact that his offshore gambling records were currently sitting on a federal prosecutor desk. And then there was Jamal. He was working the room with the sickening, practiced charm of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. He shook hands with the corporate executives from his tech sales firm, clapping them on the back and introducing them to prominent members of his mother congregation. He had positioned himself as the ultimate symbol of Black excellence, A newly promoted regional sales director, a devoted family man, and a heroic single father who had valiantly saved his infant son from a tragic, unstable marriage. Beside me in the SUV, attorney, Sterling checked her designer watch. It was exactly 8:45 in the evening. The eviction notices have been electronically filed with building security. Sterling said, her voice a calm, clinical instrument of war. The commercial lockouts are active. The corporate termination package was delivered to Jamal's CEO at his private residence this morning. The federal agents are moving into position right now. I looked out the tinted window. Two unmarked sedans pulled up to the curb, discreetly parking near the side entrance of the tower. Plainclothes federal agents stepped out, their badges hidden beneath dark windbreakers. They secured the perimeter with silent, practiced efficiency. Two uniformed police officers walked up to our SUV and gave a sharp, confirming nod to the private security team we had hired to flank us. "It is time," Maya Sterling said, adjusting the collar of her immaculate blazer. "Let us go collect your rent." I stepped out of the vehicle and into the cool, crisp night air. I was not wearing morning clothes. I was not wearing the exhausted, wrinkled beige sweater I wore to the mediation hearing. I wore a tailored, immaculate white power suit. The fabric was sharp, pristine, and unyielding. The color was a deliberate, calculated choice. White was the color of blinding truth. It was the color of absolute authority. I walked toward the grand entrance of my building, my spine perfectly straight, my head held high, radiating the lethal, focused energy of a corporate executioner. Inside the lobby, the jazz quartet finished their set. A hush fell over the elegant crowd as Jamal stepped up onto the grand, sweeping marble staircase located in the very center of the room. A microphone stand had been set up on the landing. He tapped the microphone twice, the sharp thumping sound echoing through the cavernous space. The guests turned their attention toward him, raising their glasses in anticipation. I paused just outside the heavy frosted glass double doors, watching him through the transparent panels. Attorney Sterling stood firmly at my right side, holding a sleek black leather briefcase containing their financial death warrants. Two massive private security guards stood at my left. The uniformed police officers waited patiently in the shadows of the exterior vestibule, their radios crackling softly in the quiet night. "Thank you all for joining us on this magnificent evening," Jamal began, his voice booming over the state-of-the-art sound system. His tone was dripping with manufactured humility. "Tonight is about more than just business. It is about the power of family. It is about legacy. It is about what happens when you refuse to let adversity define you." The crowd let out a murmur of respectful agreement. Beatrice placed a hand over her heart, looking up at her son with a sickening display of feigned emotion. "As many of you know, my family has faced a very difficult, very painful storm recently." Jamal continued, bowing his head slightly, for dramatic effect. "I found myself navigating the dark, terrifying waters of single fatherhood. I had to protect my beautiful son, Leo, from a situation that was deeply unsafe and deeply tragic. But God is good. And with the unwavering support of my incredible mother, Beatrice, and my brilliant sister Chloe, we turned that darkness into light." He gestured broadly toward the newly renovated boutique. "We turned our pain into purpose. We built this foundation right here in the heart of the city to show the world that Black excellence cannot be broken. We built this to secure a generational empire for my son." I gave a silent nod to the building security guard standing inside the vestibule. The guard reached over to the master control panel on the wall. With a single flick of a switch, the ambient background music playing softly over the lobby speakers was abruptly and entirely cut off. The sudden dead silence in the massive room was jarring. Jamal froze mid-speech, tapping the microphone again, assuming a technical malfunction had occurred. The guests looked around in confusion, the comfortable rhythm of the party instantly broken. The security guard pushed open the heavy glass double doors. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the grand lobby. The sound of my heels striking the polished marble floor echoed like gunshots in the dead quiet room. Click, click, click. I walked with slow, measured, terrifying precision. Attorney Sterling marched beside me, a grim, satisfied shadow. The private security team flanked us, their sheer size demanding immediate submission. The crowd near the entrance parted instantly, falling back as if physically pushed by the sheer force of my presence. The people who had been whispering about my supposed mental breakdown just minutes before now stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I did not look at a single one of them. My gaze was locked entirely, exclusively on the grand staircase. Beatrice was standing near the bottom of the steps. She turned her head to see what was causing the commotion at the entrance. Her eyes landed on my immaculate white suit. She looked at my perfectly styled hair, my sharp, flawless makeup, and the cold, dead expression on my face. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Beatrice's fingers. It hit the solid marble floor with a sharp, violent crash. The glass shattered into 100 glittering pieces, the expensive liquid splashing across the hem of her emerald gown. The sound of the breaking glass shattered the remaining stillness of the room. Whispers broke out among the church congregation. People began pointing. Chloe stepped out from the doorway of her boutique, the smug smile completely sliding off her face, replaced by a mask of sudden, paralyzing confusion. I did not stop walking. I passed the shattered glass. I passed Beatrice, who was standing frozen like a statue, her mouth slightly open, unable to draw breath. I reached the bottom of the grand staircase. Jamal was standing on the landing, gripping the microphone stand. The color had completely and entirely drained from his face. His arrogant, boastful posture collapsed inward. His eyes darted from me to Attorney Sterling, and then to the silhouettes of the police officers waiting near the entrance. His chest began to heave with sudden, frantic, shallow breaths. The microphone picked up the sound of his panicked breathing, broadcasting his terror to every single guest in the room. I ascended the marble stairs. I took my time. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to stand trapped under the blinding spotlight he had demanded for himself. I reached the landing and stepped directly into his personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and cold sweat. He was shaking. The man who had screamed at me in my kitchen, the man who had stolen my infant son and thrown my belongings onto the lawn, was physically trembling in front of me. I looked into his terrified, desperate eyes. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp, lethal smile. I reached out and gently but firmly wrapped my fingers around the microphone. Jamal's hands were shaking so violently that he released his grip without a fight. I pulled the microphone away from him. I turned my back to my husband. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces. I looked at the church elders, the city council members, the corporate executives, and the toxic matriarch standing paralyzed at the bottom of the stairs. I held the microphone to my lips. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice ringing clear, steady, and dripping with absolute power. "Welcome to my building." I hit send and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The screen went dark, but the reality of what had just happened was blindingly bright. For the first 2 miles, I drove with mechanical precision. I stopped at every red light. I used my turn signals. I was a phantom maneuvering a 2-ton machine through the wealthy suburban streets I had paid to live in. The adrenaline that had kept my spine rigid and my voice steady was still flooding my veins, a chemical armor protecting me from the unbearable truth. But as I turned onto the interstate, distancing myself from the neighborhood, the armor began to crack. I glanced at the rear-view mirror out of sheer maternal habit. The back seat was empty. Leo's rear-facing car seat sat there, a hollow, padded shell. Just this morning, I had tickled his small, warm toes while strapping him in. I had kissed his feverish cheek and promised him Mommy would be back before dinner. Now, he was trapped in a house with a man who viewed him as a legal chess piece and a grandmother who viewed him as a trophy. The first sob tore out of my throat before I could stop it. It was not a delicate, quiet sound. It was a violent guttural heave that ripped through my chest and stole the oxygen from my lungs. I swerved hard onto the gravel shoulder of the highway, slamming the gearshift into park. I could not see the road anymore. My vision was completely obscured by a tidal wave of tears. I threw off my seatbelt, doubling over the steering wheel, and let out a sound I had never heard myself make before. It was the primal, agonizing scream of a mother physically severed from her infant. The physical pain was overwhelming. My chest ached with the heavy, dull throb of a nursing mother missing her child. My arms felt physically empty, aching with the phantom weight of his body. They had taken my baby. They had weaponized my long hours at the office, the very hours I worked to secure his future, and twisted them into a narrative of abandonment. Jamal had handed my feverish son over to Beatrice, a woman who had complained about catching his germs just the night before. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, the horn blaring loudly, joining my screams into the empty space of the car. I screamed until my throat was raw and tasting of copper. I screamed for the years I had wasted trying to make Jamal feel like a king while he secretly planned my execution. I screamed for the relentless, exhausting effort of trying to be the perfect corporate executive, the perfect wife and the perfect mother, only to be tossed out like trash on my own front lawn. Beatrice's parting words echoed in my mind, a toxic loop playing over and over. Go back to the projects. The boy belongs to us now. She thought she had won. She thought stripping me of my dignity, my property, and my child would shatter me into a million irreparable pieces. She expected me to crawl into a dark hole and die of a broken heart. She expected me to fight blindly to show up at her church or my house, screaming like a lunatic, giving them exactly the evidence they needed to permanently terminate my maternal rights. I rested my forehead against the cool leather of the steering wheel, gasping for air. The windows of my car were completely fogged up from my ragged breathing. I sat there on the side of the highway for 20 minutes, letting the absolute worst of the grief wash over me, letting the sheer terror of losing Leo run its course. I allowed the pain to break me down to the very foundation of my soul. And then I stopped crying. The transition was not gradual. It was immediate and absolute. The tears stopped falling. My breathing slowed, evening out into long, measured intakes of air. I lifted my head from the steering wheel and looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my mascara was ruined, my hair was disheveled. I looked like the broken, defeated woman Jamal and Beatrice wanted me to be. I reached into the center console, pulled out a packet of makeup wipes, and began scrubbing the ruined mascara from my face. With every swipe, I was erasing the accommodating patient, forgiving wife who had endured their disrespect for the sake of family harmony. That woman was dead. They had killed her on the front lawn. In her place emerged something entirely different. The grief evaporated, replaced by a cold, concentrated, and lethal rage. It was not a chaotic anger. It was the terrifying clinical focus of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to destroy. Jamal thought he was playing chess because he managed to secure a fraudulent ex parte order. He thought he was a mastermind because he found a corrupt notary and a sympathetic judge. He had no concept of the war he had just initiated. He had poked a sleeping bear, believing he had killed it, unaware that he had just invited a predator into his home. I started the engine. The roar of the motor felt different now, no longer a vehicle of escape, but a chariot of retribution. I merged back onto the highway, the tires gripping the asphalt with renewed purpose. I nodded, my hands steady on my keyboard. The pain of missing my son was safely locked away in a titanium vault inside my chest. It would fuel my endurance for the days to come. The good, accommodating patient wife had been left dead on the suburban grass. The Ice Queen had officially taken her seat at the table, and I was ready to bring the entire empire crashing down on their heads. I pulled up the first encrypted folder on my laptop. The glow of the screen washed over the polished mahogany table, illuminating the precise, sharp angles of Attorney Sterling's face. She did not waste a single second offering sympathy or asking about my emotional state. The time for maternal comfort had expired the moment the police forced me off my own property. We were now operating strictly within the parameters of federal law, forensic accounting, and tactical destruction. Open the transaction ledger for the home equity line of credit, Sterling commanded, pulling a fresh legal pad toward her. We are building the federal indictment right now. I want exact dates, timestamps, and routing numbers. We are establishing the timeline of the bank fraud first. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I bypassed the standard consumer interface and accessed the raw downloaded data files I had secured during the night. I projected the ledger onto the large flat-screen monitor mounted at the end of the conference table. The HELOC was approved and finalized exactly 19 days ago. I stated, highlighting the specific line item on the screen. The principal amount of $300,000 was deposited into a secondary dispersal account registered solely under Jamal's Social Security number. The deposit cleared at precisely 9:14 in the morning. Sterling wrote the date and time on her legal pad with a heavy gold pen. To secure a HELOC of that magnitude, Jamal had to sign the closing disclosures, the promissory note, and the deed of trust in the physical presence of a loan officer and a licensed notary public. He could not do that digitally. He had to walk into a physical bank branch. I opened the PDF copy of the finalized deed of trust. I scrolled to the final page, enlarging the signature block. There was my forged signature written in blue ink. Beside it sat the official black stamp of the notary public. "The notary is Thomas Vance," I said, pointing to the stamp. "He is a deacon at Beatrice's church and a regular at Jamal's weekly poker games." He authenticated a fraudulent signature. Sterling let out a sharp, predatory laugh. "Excellent. Thomas Vance just bought himself a front-row seat to a federal conspiracy charge. But a corrupt notary is not enough for an airtight conviction. Jamal's defense attorney will argue that you signed the document in private, and Jamal simply brought it to the bank. We need physical, indisputable proof that you were nowhere near that bank, and we need proof that Jamal presented the forged document himself." She picked up her desk phone and dialed a number from memory. Sterling did not bother with customer service hotlines or low-level branch managers. She operated at the highest levels of the city's legal infrastructure. She was calling the executive general counsel for the national bank that had issued the fraudulent loan. "Marcus, it is Sterling," she said the moment the line connected. Her tone was brisk and entirely devoid of pleasantries. "I have a catastrophic compliance failure originating from your downtown branch. One of your loan officers facilitated a $300,000 fraudulent mortgage dispersal using a forged signature and a compromised notary. My client is the sole title holder of the collateral property, and she was sitting in her corporate office across the city when the ink dried on your closing documents." I listened to the faint, panicked voice on the other end of the line. Sterling cut him off before he could launch into corporate defense protocols. "I am not asking for an internal review, Marcus. I am sending a preservation of evidence mandate to your office right now. I need the interior, exterior, and private office surveillance footage from your downtown branch for the entire morning of the closing date. I need the loan officer's digital footprint, and I need the visitor log. If that footage accidentally deletes or magically corrupts on a standard 30-day server wipe, I will personally name your board of directors in the civil suit." She hung up the phone and looked at me, her eyes gleaming with tactical satisfaction. "The bank's legal department is on lockdown. They will pull the footage within the hour to protect their own liability. The cameras will prove Jamal walked into that bank alone, handed them a document with your forged signature, and walked out with $300,000 of your home equity. That immediately triggers Title 18 United States Code, Section 1344 for bank fraud, carrying a maximum penalty of 30 years in federal prison, and aggravated identity theft under Section 1028. AI added, pulling up the federal statutes I had memorized during my career as a financial auditor. Because he knowingly used my name and my legal identification to execute the fraud, the court will stack a mandatory consecutive 2-year prison sentence on top of the bank fraud conviction." "Exactly," Sterling confirmed, writing the statutes in bold red ink on her notepad. "But domestic bank fraud is just the appetizer. Let us talk about the international wire transfers. Show me the money trail." I minimized the mortgage documents and brought up the outgoing wire transfer logs from Jamal's dispersal account. I highlighted the largest transaction first, $120,000 routed out of the account. Exactly 3 days after the loan closed, I explained, tracing my finger along the digital ledger. The funds were sent through the SWIFT network to a holding account in the Cayman Islands. Sterling narrowed her eyes, leaning closer to the monitor. "A mid-level sales director does not send 6 figures to the Cayman Islands unless he is hiding assets or paying off illicit debt. Who is the beneficiary?" "The beneficiary is obscured behind a shell corporation," I replied, typing rapidly to open my secondary folder of evidence. "But I recognize the routing sequence from a previous corporate audit. It belongs to a massive offshore sports betting syndicate. Jamal did not gamble the money himself. I pulled his email archives. I projected the frantic, desperate email chain between Jamal and Darius onto the large screen. The text was undeniable. Darius was begging for a bailout, explicitly stating that underground bookmakers were threatening his physical safety and threatening to show up at Chloe's boutique. Jamal had responded by promising to wire the funds to clear the debt immediately. Sterling placed both hands flat on the table, her legal mind processing the staggering implications of the emails. "Do you understand what your idiot husband just did?" she asked, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "This is no longer a simple domestic dispute over hidden marital assets. Darius owed money to an illegal, unregulated gambling syndicate. Jamal used fraudulently obtained funds from a federally insured bank and wired them across international borders to settle an illicit debt. He committed international wire fraud," I stated, the puzzle pieces clicking together flawlessly. "He committed international wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy," Sterling corrected. "He effectively washed stolen bank funds through a foreign criminal enterprise." Federal prosecutors spend their entire careers looking for cases wrapped up this perfectly with a bow. Darius is completely exposed. The moment we hand these wire receipts over to the FBI field office, they will freeze Darius's accounts, seize his leased luxury cars, and drag him into an interrogation room. I looked at the transaction ledger again. Jamal had orchestrated this entire scheme to play the powerful, wealthy patriarch for a family of parasites. He wanted the adoration of his mother and the desperate gratitude of his sister and brother-in-law. He wanted the illusion of absolute control, completely ignorant of the financial tripwires he was sprinting through. "We have the bank fraud, and we have the international wire fraud," I said, shifting to the next line item on the ledger. "But he also took care of his mother. $95,000 was drawn via certified cashier's check payable to the luxury auto dealership on the north side. He bought Beatrice a brand new Mercedes SUV. She drove it to church on Sunday to show off to the congregation. Sterling wrote Beatrice's name on the notepad, drawing a heavy, thick circle around it. We are going to let her enjoy that car for a little while longer. The moment the federal indictment drops, the government will seize that vehicle under asset forfeiture laws because it was purchased with the proceeds of bank fraud. They will impound it right out of the church parking lot if they have to." I took a sip of water, the cold liquid soothing my raw throat. The panic that had consumed me on the highway was entirely gone. I was functioning in a state of absolute hyper-focused clarity. I was no longer looking at my husband and my in-laws. I was looking at targets on a board, analyzing their vulnerabilities, mapping their complete destruction. "We have accounted for $215,000, Sterling noted, tapping her pen against the mahogany table. "Where did the remaining $85,000 go?" I pulled up the final initial wire transfer. $85,000 transferred directly into a commercial business account, registered to Chloe Kuchar, LLC. It is for Chloe's fake luxury fashion boutique. Jamal paid her commercial lease deposit, hired her interior design contractors, and bought her initial inventory. Sterling frowned, her eyes scanning the LLC registration details I had projected on the screen. "Did you run the address of the commercial property Chloe leased?" "I have not run the physical address yet," I admitted. I was focused on securing the offshore routing numbers and the notary details before Jamal locked me out. "Pull the commercial lease agreement from his email," Sterling commanded, her posture suddenly shifting. "Let us see exactly where Chloe is setting up this vanity project." I typed Chloe's name into the search bar of Jamal's email archive. The search returned a massive PDF file containing the finalized commercial lease agreement. Jamal had received a copy for his records because he had wired the funds to secure the space. I downloaded the document and scrolled down to the property description and the landlord information. As the text rendered on the large monitor, I felt the air leave my lungs. I stared at the address of the commercial building. I stared at the name of the property management company listed as the landlord on the lease. A slow, chilling smile crept across my face. I looked over at Sterling. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the screen, and then she let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed off the walls of the war room. "The universe has a beautiful, wicked sense of humor," Sterling whispered, leaning back in her heavy leather chair. I looked back at the lease agreement, the absolute perfection of the situation settling over me like a heavy iron mantle. Jamal and Chloe had no idea what they had just done. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with, or the true scale of the hidden empire I had built entirely outside of their arrogant, limited comprehension. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with, or the true scale of the hidden empire I had built entirely outside of their arrogant, limited comprehension. Sterling leaned forward until her chest nearly touched the edge of the mahogany conference table. She reached out and tapped a manicured fingernail against the glowing monitor. She read the address printed at the top of Chloe commercial lease agreement out loud. It was the Montgomery Tower, a highly prestigious, newly revitalized commercial high-rise located dead center in the city, most exclusive luxury shopping and business district. A heavy, breathless silence fell over the war room. Sterling kept her eyes locked on the digital document for a full 10 seconds. She scrutinized the listed property management firm, the landlord's signature block, and the corporate entity holding the deed. Then Sterling leaned back in her heavy leather chair, threw her head back and let out a rich, booming laugh that reverberated off the walls. It was the uninhibited, joyous laugh of a seasoned legal predator who had just realized the opposing side had voluntarily walked into an active volcano. "The universe has a beautiful, wicked sense of humor," Sterling whispered, wiping a tear of absolute amusement from the corner of her eye. "Tell me I am reading this correctly, Maya. Please tell me your idiot husband and his spoiled sister just signed a 10-year commercial lease at the Montgomery Tower." I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, a cold, predatory smile slowly stretching across my face. "You are reading it exactly right," I replied, my voice steady and vibrating with newfound power. They secured the prime ground floor corner retail space for Chloe Fake Luxury Boutique. And look at the second schedule attached to the document. Jamal did not just secure a space for his sister. He negotiated a secondary commercial lease for the entire third-floor executive suite to serve as the new regional headquarters for his tech sales firm. Sterling shook her head in sheer disbelief. He convinced his corporate CEO to move their branch into that building just so he could walk into the marble lobby every morning and play the role of a wealthy titan of industry. He wanted the prestige. He wanted to post photos of that glass facade on social media and brag to his church congregation about his unparalleled black excellence. He chose the most expensive, highly coveted commercial real estate in the downtown corridor to inflate his fragile ego. "He chose my building," I stated. The absolute perfection of the trap was almost staggering to comprehend. Jamal and Chloe had spent their entire lives obsessed with flashy brands, leased luxury cars, and the shallow appearance of wealth. They despised me because I preferred quiet savings, modest suburban living, and rigorous financial discipline. They constantly mocked me for acting like a mere corporate worker bee while they styled themselves as visionaries. They never bothered to understand complex real estate portfolios, corporate shielding, or asset diversification. If they had, they would have known that 3 years ago, I foresaw the massive gentrification and urban renewal project planned for the downtown district. I took my accumulated corporate bonuses, my stock options, and my aggressive investment returns, and I funneled them into a blind trust. I used that trust to form a stealth holding company registered in Delaware, entirely shielding my identity behind layers of registered agents and corporate privacy laws. I named the entity Obsidian Vanguard Holdings. Through that company, I purchased the Montgomery Tower out of commercial foreclosure for a fraction of its current value. I was the silent sole majority shareholder of the very property management firm listed on the top of the lease agreement Jamal had just signed. Jamal never knew. He was so consumed with proving his dominance over me in the kitchen, so obsessed with stealing my liquid cash to fund his family vanity projects, that he never looked at the broader financial chessboard. He simply saw a glamorous building with a steep rent and decided he needed to conquer it to prove his worth to Beatrice. "Let us break down the exact mathematics of this phenomenal stupidity," Sterling said, her legal mind shifting into high gear. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from her legal pad. "Chloe took the initial $85,000 of your stolen home equity to secure the commercial deposit pay, the exorbitant retainer for high-end interior designers, and begin the immediate build-out of the retail space. But it does not stop there." Sterling pointed her pen at the guarantor clause embedded deep within the lease contract. "Look at Section 4, Paragraph B. Chloe has absolutely no credit history and a trail of failed businesses. The property management company, which is your company, required a primary financial guarantor with a six-figure salary to co-sign the 10-year commercial lease. Jamal signed as the unconditional financial guarantor for both Chloe retail space and his own corporate office suite expansion. I leaned in my eyes, tracking the legal stipulations. He leveraged the remaining capital he stole from my house along with his entire projected future income to guarantee those leases. He promised the landlord, which is me, that he would cover any default, any structural damage, and all custom renovations. And what exactly are they renovating? Sterling asked, pulling up the contractor proposals attached to the email thread. I scrolled through the architectural plans Chloe had gleefully submitted to the property management portal for approval. She was not just slapping some paint on the walls. Driven by Beatrice's demand for absolute luxury, Chloe had hired elite contractors to rip out the foundational flooring. She was installing custom imported Italian marble. She was erecting bespoke, floor-to-ceiling glass display cases with integrated LED lighting. She was upgrading the central HVAC system and installing high-end architectural fixtures. Jamal was doing the exact same thing on the third floor, outfitting his executive sales suite with frosted glass conference rooms and premium hardwood flooring. Between the stolen cash they had already deployed and the lines of credit Jamal had guaranteed against his own salary to finish the construction, they were pouring well over $300,000 of capital directly into the physical infrastructure of the Montgomery Tower. Sterling tapped the screen with her pen. Let us review the commercial landlord and tenant statutes regarding property improvements. Under a standard ironclad commercial lease, any permanent fixtures, structural upgrades, and custom property improvements automatically become the permanent property of the landlord the moment they are installed. They cannot be removed without the landlord express written permission. They are upgrading my building for free, I said, the sheer magnitude of their unforced error finally washing over me entirely. They stole the equity out of my suburban house, committed federal bank fraud, and then voluntarily handed every single dime of that stolen wealth right back into my primary commercial real estate asset. They are increasing the overall property valuation of the Montgomery Tower by hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they are doing it with my own stolen money. It is poetic justice, Maya Sterling said, her voice turning razor sharp. But it gets substantially better. Because the initial deposit and the contractor payments were secured using funds obtained through federal bank fraud and identity theft, the lease agreement itself is fundamentally breached from the moment of inception. The contract contains a standard morality and criminal enterprise clause. I saw exactly where she was going. The moment the FBI drops the federal indictment on Jamal for forging the home equity line of credit, my property management company has the absolute legal right to instantly invalidate the commercial lease. Commercial eviction is not like residential eviction. Sterling continued writing rapidly on her notepad. There are no lengthy grace periods. There are no sympathetic judges giving them 90 days to find a new place. The moment they are indicted, your management firm serves them with an emergency commercial lockout notice. The contractors will finish laying down that beautiful Italian marble, and right before Chloe plans to host her grand opening ribbon cutting, you change the locks on the glass doors. We seize the property. I stated the strategy, locking firmly into place. We seize the property, we keep every single luxury upgrade they installed, and we immediately release the fully renovated spaces to legitimate corporate tenants at double the original rental rate. I will not just recoup the money Jamal stole from my house, I will exponentially multiply it on the commercial real estate market. And Jamal remains legally bound as the guarantor for the breach of contract. Sterling added, a ruthless smile playing on her lips. He will be facing 30 years in federal prison for the bank fraud dealing with the fallout of the international wire transfers to Darius illegal bookmakers, and facing a massive civil lawsuit from your property management firm for breaking a 10-year commercial lease. He will be utterly, completely, and permanently bankrupted. The image of Jamal standing on my front lawn, clutching my son and crying fake tears for the police officers flashed through my mind. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect ambush. He thought he had outsmarted the quiet, exhausted wife who spent her evenings balancing spreadsheets. He had no idea that his fragile, toxic ego had marched his entire family directly into a financial slaughterhouse. Beatrice told me to go back to the projects, I murmured, staring at the flawless commercial lease agreement on the monitor. She stood on my driveway and told me I did not belong in their neighborhood. She wanted to build a dynasty for her children using my blood and my labor. Sterling placed her hand over mine, her grip firm and grounding. She wanted a dynasty, Maya. You are going to give them a demolition. A man facing decades in federal prison, crushing corporate debt and absolute public disgrace cannot sustain a family court custody battle. When we present this criminal dossier to the family court judge, that temporary restraining order Jamal secured today will be evaporated. The judge will not just return Leo to you. The judge will strip Jamal of all parental rights for exposing a child to a convicted felon. The pain of missing my son flared brightly in my chest, but it was immediately swallowed by the cold, mechanical certainty of the plan. I did not need to cry anymore. I did not need to scream at the unfairness of the world. The legal machinery was already humming to life, fueled by the staggering arrogance of my enemies. Draw up the commercial eviction notices, I told Sterling, my voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority. Prepare the corporate termination files for Jamal's CEO. Contact the federal prosecutors and hand them the wire fraud ledger on a silver platter. Let Chloe and Jamal finish buying the expensive marble. Let Beatrice plan her grand opulent parties in the lobby of the building. Let them climb to the very top of their imaginary throne. Because when they reach the peak, I will be the one standing there to push them off. I sat in the back of a heavily tinted black SUV parked directly across the street from the Montgomery Tower. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the grand lobby, I had a flawless front-row seat to the absolute peak of their delusion. The gala was in full swing, and they had spared no expense with my stolen money. The sprawling marble floors of my building had been transformed into a scene of staggering performative opulence. Waiters in crisp black tuxedos circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and imported hors d'oeuvres. A live jazz quartet played smooth, sophisticated music from a raised platform near the cascading indoor waterfall. I watched the toxic hierarchy of my former family display itself for the entire city to see. Beatrice was entirely in her element. She wore a glittering floor-length emerald gown that swept across the polished stone. She was holding court with the senior pastor of her megachurch and two prominent local city council members. I could see her laughing warmly, touching the pastor on the arm, pointing proudly toward the frosted glass doors of Chloe's new luxury boutique. She was playing the role of the triumphant, deeply blessed matriarch who had successfully guided her flock through a storm. Chloe stood near the entrance of her fake business, posing for professional photographers. She was draped in designer labels, holding a glass of champagne, and directing the cameras to capture the custom Italian marble and the gold leaf display cases she had installed using the equity ripped from my home. Darius lingered near the open bar, nursing a glass of top-shelf bourbon. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and laughed too loudly at jokes made by men he desperately wanted to impress. He looked entirely relaxed, completely oblivious to the fact that his offshore gambling records were currently sitting on a federal prosecutor desk. And then there was Jamal. He was working the room with the sickening practiced charm of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. He shook hands with the corporate executives from his tech sales firm, clapping them on the back and introducing them to prominent members of his mother congregation. He had positioned himself as the ultimate symbol of Black excellence. A newly promoted regional sales director, a devoted family man, and a heroic single father who had valiantly saved his infant son from a tragic, unstable marriage. Beside me in the SUV, attorney Sterling checked her designer watch. It was exactly 8:45 in the evening. The eviction notices have been electronically filed with building security. Sterling said, her voice a calm clinical instrument of war. The commercial lockouts are active. The corporate termination package was delivered to Jamal's CEO at his private residence this morning. The federal agents are moving into position right now. I looked out the tinted window. Two unmarked sedans pulled up to the curb, discreetly parking near the side entrance of the tower. Plainclothes federal agents stepped out, their badges hidden beneath dark windbreakers. They secured the perimeter with silent, practiced efficiency. Two uniformed police officers walked up to our SUV and gave a sharp, confirming nod to the private security team we had hired to flank us. "It is time," Maya Sterling said, adjusting the collar of her immaculate blazer. "Let us go collect your rent." I stepped out of the vehicle and into the cool, crisp night air. I was not wearing morning clothes. I was not wearing the exhausted, wrinkled beige sweater I wore to the mediation hearing. I wore a tailored, immaculate white power suit. The fabric was sharp, pristine, and unyielding. The color was a deliberate, calculated choice. White was the color of blinding truth. It was the color of absolute authority. I walked toward the grand entrance of my building, my spine perfectly straight, my head held high, radiating the lethal, focused energy of a corporate executioner. Inside the lobby, the jazz quartet finished their set. A hush fell over the elegant crowd as Jamal stepped up onto the grand, sweeping marble staircase located in the very center of the room. A microphone stand had been set up on the landing. He tapped the microphone twice, the sharp thumping sound echoing through the cavernous space. The guests turned their attention toward him, raising their glasses in anticipation. I paused just outside the heavy frosted glass double doors, watching him through the transparent panels. Attorney Sterling stood firmly at my right side, holding a sleek black leather briefcase containing their financial death warrants. Two massive private security guards stood at my left. The uniformed police officers waited patiently in the shadows of the exterior vestibule, their radios crackling softly in the quiet night. "Thank you all for joining us on this magnificent evening," Jamal began, his voice booming over the state-of-the-art sound system. His tone was dripping with manufactured humility. "Tonight is about more than just business. It is about the power of family. It is about legacy. It is about what happens when you refuse to let adversity define you." The crowd let out a murmur of respectful agreement. Beatrice placed a hand over her heart, looking up at her son with a sickening display of feigned emotion. "As many of you know, my family has faced a very difficult, very painful storm recently." Jamal continued, bowing his head slightly for dramatic effect. "I found myself navigating the dark, terrifying waters of single fatherhood. I had to protect my beautiful son Leo from a situation that was deeply unsafe and deeply tragic. But God is good, and with the unwavering support of my incredible mother, Beatrice, and my brilliant sister Chloe, we turned that darkness into light." He gestured broadly toward the newly renovated boutique. "We turned our pain into purpose. We built this foundation right here in the heart of the city to show the world that Black excellence cannot be broken. We built this to secure a generational empire for my son." I gave a silent nod to the building security guard standing inside the vestibule. The guard reached over to the master control panel on the wall. With a single flick of a switch, the ambient background music playing softly over the lobby speakers was abruptly and entirely cut off. The sudden dead silence in the massive room was jarring. Jamal froze mid-speech, tapping the microphone again, assuming a technical malfunction had occurred. The guests looked around in confusion, the comfortable rhythm of the party instantly broken. The security guard pushed open the heavy glass double doors. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the grand lobby. The sound of my heels striking the polished marble floor echoed like gunshots in the dead quiet room. Click, click, click. I walked with slow, measured, terrifying precision. Attorney Sterling marched beside me, a grim, satisfied shadow. The private security team flanked us, their sheer size demanding immediate submission. The crowd near the entrance parted instantly, falling back as if physically pushed by the sheer force of my presence. The people who had been whispering about my supposed mental breakdown just minutes before now stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I did not look at a single one of them. My gaze was locked entirely exclusively on the grand staircase. Beatrice was standing near the bottom of the steps. She turned her head to see what was causing the commotion at the entrance. Her eyes landed on my immaculate white suit. She looked at my perfectly styled hair, my sharp, flawless makeup, and the cold, dead expression on my face. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Beatrice's fingers. It hit the solid marble floor with a sharp, violent crash. The glass shattered into 100 glittering pieces, the expensive liquid splashing across the hem of her emerald gown. The sound of the breaking glass shattered the remaining stillness of the room. Whispers broke out among the church congregation. People began pointing. Chloe stepped out from the doorway of her boutique, the smug smile completely sliding off her face, replaced by a mask of sudden, paralyzing confusion. I did not stop walking. I passed the shattered glass. I passed Beatrice, who was standing frozen like a statue, her mouth slightly open, unable to draw breath. I reached the bottom of the grand staircase. Jamal was standing on the landing, gripping the microphone stand. The color had completely and entirely drained from his face. His arrogant, boastful posture collapsed inward. His eyes darted from me to Attorney Sterling, and then to the silhouettes of the police officers waiting near the entrance. His chest began to heave with sudden, frantic, shallow breaths. The microphone picked up the sound of his panicked breathing, broadcasting his terror to every single guest in the room. I ascended the marble stairs. I took my time. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to stand trapped under the blinding spotlight he had demanded for himself. I reached the landing and stepped directly into his personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and cold sweat. He was shaking. The man who had screamed at me in my kitchen, the man who had stolen my infant son and thrown my belongings onto the lawn, was physically trembling in front of me. I looked into his terrified, desperate eyes. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp, lethal smile. I reached out and gently but firmly wrapped my fingers around the microphone. Jamal's hands were shaking so violently that he released his grip without a fight. I pulled the microphone away from him. I turned my back to my husband. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces. I looked at the church elders, the city council members, the corporate executives, and the toxic matriarch standing paralyzed at the bottom of the stairs. I held the microphone to my lips. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice ringing clear, steady, and dripping with absolute power. "Welcome to my building." The whisper rippled through the crowd, a collective, sharp intake of breath. I watched the realization wash over the faces of the city council members, the corporate executives, and the prominent church elders. They looked from me standing flawlessly in white, to Jamal, who was gripping the banister as if his legs were about to give out. Beatrice remained frozen at the base of the stairs, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The microphone amplified the cold, precise edge of my words, cutting through the heavy air of the grand lobby. "I promised you all a celebration of Black excellence tonight." I continued, my gaze sweeping across the room. "I promised we would talk about legacy, about building empires, and about truth. Since my husband and his family have been so eager to share stories about my life with this esteemed community, I decided it was only fair that I return the favor. I brought gifts." I raised my left hand slightly. At the back of the lobby, the head of the catering staff, a man I had personally compensated extremely well for his discretion, gave a sharp nod. 6 waiters in black tuxedos immediately broke away from the service stations. They were not carrying trays of champagne or imported hors d'oeuvres. They carried polished silver trays holding thick, heavily embossed silver gift envelopes. The waiters moved with military precision through the parted crowd. They approached the base of the stairs where Beatrice, Chloe, and Darius stood. Another waiter ascended the marble steps and stopped directly beside Jamal, extending the silver tray. Jamal stared at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. "Go ahead," I urged softly into the microphone, my smile never wavering. "Open them. It is rude to reject a gift at your own gala." Chloe was the first to tear into her envelope. Her manicured acrylic nails ripped the silver paper. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the heavy black seal of the county sheriff department. She scanned the first page, her eyes darting back and forth frantically. I watched the blood drain from her face, leaving her ashen and trembling. "That is a commercial eviction notice with immediate effect," I announced, addressing the entire room while looking directly at my sister-in-law. Chloe Couture, Limited Liability Company, is officially in breach of its commercial lease. The property management firm, which I own entirely, has a strict morality and criminal enterprise clause. Because you used funds obtained through federal bank fraud to secure your deposit and pay your contractors, your lease is void. Chloe let out a strangled gasp, dropping the papers onto the marble floor. I want to personally thank you, Chloe, I continued, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. I want to thank you for taking $300,000 of stolen money and pouring it directly into my real estate asset. I will be keeping the custom Italian marble floors, the bespoke glass display cases, and the high-end architectural fixtures you installed. Building security has already deactivated your access codes. Your boutique belongs to me now. Beatrice let out a high-pitched wail, grabbing Chloe's arm. You cannot do this, Beatrice shrieked, finally breaking her paralyzed silence. You have no right. This is our night. But I was not finished. I shifted my gaze to Darius, who was staring at his own silver envelope with visible dread. He slowly broke the seal and pulled out a stack of federal court summons. Darius, I said, my tone shifting to one of profound pity. You have spent years parading around the city, leasing luxury cars you cannot afford, and calling yourself an entrepreneur. You loved looking down on people who work honest 9-to-5 jobs. I suggest you read the second page of your gift. Darius swallowed hard, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the paper. That is a federal court summons regarding your massive, unregulated offshore gambling debts, I explained to the crowd. Darius owes over $100,000 to an illegal sports betting syndicate. He was so terrified of the loan sharks coming to his house that he begged my husband for a bailout. And my husband, desperate to play the wealthy patriarch, stole the equity out of my suburban home to pay off those violent criminals. The church congregation erupted into shocked gasps. The senior pastor, who had been standing next to Beatrice just moments ago, took a deliberate, horrified step backward. Darius dropped his head, unable to look at the investors and community leaders he had been desperately schmoozing all evening. His entire fake, flashy facade was instantly disintegrated in front of the people he wanted to impress the most. Then I turned my body slightly, bringing my full, undivided attention to the man standing beside me on the landing. Jamal was sweating profusely. A dark, wet patch was forming at the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He was staring at the silver envelope on the tray, refusing to touch it. Take it, Jamal. I commanded, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. Or I will have Attorney Sterling read it aloud for you. His hand trembled violently as he reached out and took the envelope. He fumbled with the seal, pulling out two distinct separate documents. He unfolded the first one, a heavy piece of corporate letterhead, bearing the logo of his tech sales firm. I looked out into the crowd and easily spotted the chief executive officer of Jamal Company. He was standing near the indoor waterfall, looking absolutely livid, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. I sent a comprehensive file to your CEO this morning, I announced, ensuring every single corporate executive in the room heard me clearly. I provided them with indisputable proof of your financial crimes. Your company has a zero-tolerance policy for executives who engage in federal fraud. That first document is your immediate termination letter with cause. You are fired, Jamal. You lose the title, you lose the salary, and you lose the company car you leased to feed your massive, fragile ego. Jamal opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was suffocating on his own public destruction. Now read the second document I instructed. He unfolded the thickest packet of paper. It bore the unmistakable, terrifying seal of the United States Department of Justice. You stood on my front lawn 2 weeks ago and called the police, I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence of the room. You orchestrated a fake ambush. You claimed I was suffering from postpartum psychosis. You stole my infant son from my arms and handed him to a woman who told me to go back to the projects. You did all of that because you thought locking me out of my own house would stop me from looking at the bank ledgers. I took a single step closer to him. The scent of his fear was palpable. You underestimated me, I whispered, though the microphone caught every syllable. That document is a federal grand jury indictment. You are officially charged with 1 count of felony bank fraud, 1 count of aggravated identity theft, and 1 count of international wire fraud. You forged my signature on a $300,000 home equity line of credit, and you washed that stolen money through an illegal offshore syndicate. Jamal finally snapped. The panic and humiliation broke his brain. He crumpled the indictment in his fist and pointed a shaking finger at my face. "She is lying!" Jamal screamed into the massive lobby, his voice cracking with desperate, wild hysteria. "She is a crazy, bitter woman. She is making all of this up to ruin me because I took my son away from her abuse. Do not listen to her. There is no proof. It is her word against mine. She is insane." I did not flinch. I did not back away. I simply smiled a cold, surgical expression of absolute triumph. I raised my left hand and gave a sharp, deliberate gesture to the audiovisual team stationed on the balcony above. Instantly, the massive, custom-built projector screen that Chloe had installed to display her boutique logo began to lower from the high ceiling. The lights in the grand lobby dimmed slightly, directing every single eye in the room to the massive white canvas unrolling behind the marble staircase. "I do not expect anyone here to take my word for it," I said smoothly into the microphone. "I brought the receipts." The projector clicked on, casting a bright, high-definition image across the screen. The footage was crystal clear, pulled directly from the internal security cameras of the National Bank downtown. The timestamp in the corner glowed bright white, displaying the exact date and time the fraudulent loan was executed. The video showed the interior of a private bank office. The crowd watched in absolute horrified silence as the footage played. There was Jamal, wearing the exact same expensive watch he had on his wrist tonight. He was sitting across from a loan officer. Sitting right next to him was Thomas Vance, the deacon from Beatrice Church, holding his official notary stamp. The camera angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the mahogany desk. Jamal reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of closing disclosures and a deed of trust. He leaned over the desk, picked up a pen, and meticulously forged my signature on the bottom line. Thomas Vance then leaned over, knowingly stamped the fraudulent document, and shook Jamal's hand. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Several church ladies covered their mouths in shock. The city council members began backing away toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from an active federal crime scene. I turned to look at Jamal. The fight had completely drained out of him. His shoulders slumped, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at the 50-foot projection of his own felony being broadcast to his entire social circle. "You wanted to be the star of the show?" "Jamal," I said, my voice soft but infinitely powerful. "You wanted everyone to look at you. Well, look at them now. They see exactly what you are. You are a thief, you are a fraud, and you are entirely out of options." I turned my gaze down to Beatrice. She was leaning heavily against a marble pillar, clutching her chest, her emerald gown glittering uselessly under the dim lights. Her carefully constructed dynasty was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. I handed the microphone to the private security guard standing next to me. I had delivered the message. The performance was over. The execution was complete. All that was left was the final devastating fallout. Could we explore any other ways this narrative might resolve? As I handed the microphone away, the heavy glass doors of the Montgomery Tower swung open completely. The two uniformed police officers I had seen waiting in the vestibule marched straight into the grand lobby. They were followed immediately by 4 federal marshals wearing tactical vests with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow text across their chests. The music had long stopped. The only sound was the heavy thud of combat boots striking the Italian marble. They walked past the horrified city council members. They bypassed the silent, stunned church elders. They marched directly to the bottom of the grand staircase. Beatrice let out a blood-curdling scream. It was not the theatrical, manipulative wail she used in family court. It was a raw, visceral screech of absolute terror and shattered pride. She lunged forward, trying to grab the sleeve of the lead federal marshal, but a uniformed officer swiftly stepped in her path, blocking her with a rigid arm. Jamal did not run. There was nowhere to go. He stood on the landing, completely paralyzed, as 2 federal agents ascended the stairs. They grabbed him roughly by the shoulders, spinning him around to face the massive projector screen still displaying his felony. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the lobby was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "You are under arrest for federal bank fraud, identity theft, and international wire fraud," the lead marshal stated, his voice carrying easily through the dead silent room. You have the right to remain silent. Jamal looked down at the crowd. He looked at his former chief executive officer, who was already dialing his own legal team on his cell phone, securing the immediate termination of the disgraced man in handcuffs. Jamal looked at the senior pastor, who turned his back and walked away, actively distancing the church from a federal criminal. The golden boy of the congregation was being led down the stairs like a common thief. The ultimate loss of face was complete. His reputation, the only currency he truly valued, was incinerated. The panic began to spread. Near the open bar, Darius realized exactly what the federal presence meant for him. He dropped his glass of top-shelf bourbon, the liquid spilling over his velvet dinner jacket. He turned and sprinted toward the rear emergency exit, shoving past a group of terrified catering staff. He thought he was escaping, completely unaware that a second team of federal agents was already stationed in the alleyway to intercept him. He would not even make it to his leased Maserati before the handcuffs clicked onto his own wrists. Chloe collapsed onto the crushed velvet seating area inside her now-seized luxury boutique. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The custom glass display cases and the expensive crystal chandelier loomed over her, a massive financial graveyard built on stolen money. She was bankrupt, evicted, and publicly humiliated in front of the very high society influencers she had invited to witness her fake success. Beatrice sank to her knees on the cold marble floor. Her emerald gown pooled around her in a tragic, glittering heap. She stared wildly at Attorney Sterling, who was calmly packing her legal documents back into her black briefcase. "My car!" Beatrice gasped, her voice trembling with the sudden horrifying realization of her reality. "I drove my car here. The Mercedes." Sterling paused, looking down at the broken matriarch. "The federal marshals already have the keys, Beatrice. Asset forfeiture is immediate. You might want to ask your pastor for a ride back to the suburbs, assuming you still have a house to return to once the civil lawsuits drain whatever is left of your savings." I did not stay to watch them drag my husband out the front doors. I turned my attention away from the wreckage of their lives and scanned the far corner of the lobby. There, standing near the indoor waterfall, was the private nanny Beatrice had hired to parade my son around the gala. The young woman looked completely terrified, clutching Leo tightly to her chest. I walked down the stairs, moving with absolute calm through the chaotic, frantic crowd. People parted for me automatically, their eyes lowered in a mix of fear and deep respect. I approached the nanny. She did not hesitate. She gently transferred my son into my waiting arms. Leo blinked up at me, his warm brown eyes wide and curious. He was wearing a tiny, ridiculous tuxedo that Beatrice had undoubtedly selected, but he was safe. His fever was gone. His small hands immediately reached up and grasped the lapel of my white power suit. I pulled him tightly against my chest, burying my face in his soft neck. The physical ache that had tormented me for 14 agonizing days vanished instantly. I breathed in his scent, a fierce protective fire replacing the ice in my veins. I turned and walked toward the main exit. Attorney Sterling and the private security team formed a protective wedge around me. I stepped through the heavy glass doors of the Montgomery Tower and out into the cool, crisp night air. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the street in chaotic colors. I did not look back, not once. I walked to my waiting SUV, climbed into the back seat with my son, and ordered the driver to take us home. 3 months later, I sat behind the massive glass desk in my luxurious corner office. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. Outside, the city moved at its usual frantic pace, completely unaware of the quiet peace I had secured within these walls. The toxic family that had tried to destroy me was entirely dismantled. Jamal was currently sitting in a federal detention center, awaiting a sentencing hearing that guaranteed him at least a decade behind bars. He had attempted to plea bargain, but federal prosecutors do not offer leniency when the evidence is flawless and the fraud crosses international borders. Darius had flipped on his illegal bookmakers in a desperate bid to reduce his own sentence, permanently ruining his life and securing his place in a minimum security facility. Chloe had filed for total bankruptcy. Her credit permanently destroyed, her fake luxury lifestyle completely evaporated. Beatrice and Clarence had lost everything. The bank had seized the Mercedes and foreclosed on their suburban home after the sheer weight of legal fees drained their accounts. They were renting a small, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, utterly ostracized by the church congregation and the community leaders who had witnessed their public downfall. I looked down at the plush woven rug in the center of my office. Leo was sitting there happily stacking colorful wooden blocks. He babbled softly to himself, completely safe, completely oblivious to the war his mother had waged to secure his future. I picked up a steaming cup of coffee and leaned back in my leather executive chair. I had successfully reclaimed my suburban house, stripped Jamal of all parental rights through the family court, and exponentially increased the value of the Montgomery Tower by releasing the fully upgraded commercial spaces to legitimate corporate clients. They thought I was just a lucky orphan. They thought my success was something they could simply reach out and take. They learned the hardest, most devastating lesson of their lives. I was not just a successful woman. I was an architect of my own destiny, a mother who protected her peace, and the undisputed ruler of an empire they could never touch.